Okay, take a quick look around you right now. Look at your smartphone, think about modern medical scans, or even just the safety protocols that keep the food in your kitchen fresh. We're generally taught that all these incredible conveniences are products of the 21st century tech boom, right? Well, that is actually a complete myth. Almost everything driving your modern everyday routine was actually bought and paid for way back in the 1960s, and it was funded by a government that was, quite frankly, secretly terrified. So, let's set the stage here. Picture this. It's 1961, and President John F. Kennedy just dared NASA to land a human being on the moon. At that exact moment, the United States had a grand total of 15 minutes of human spaceflight experience. 15 minutes! This wasn't some romantic, starry-eyed mission to explore the cosmos. It was a desperate geopolitical scramble. They were reacting to the threat of Soviet military marches and the flashing lights of Sputnik overhead. To avoid living under a totalitarian sky in a deeply divided Cold War world, they realized they had to build an absolute beast of a machine. And to really wrap our heads around how insane this undertaking was, you just have to look at the hardware. The Saturn V rocket wasn't a sleek vehicle, it was essentially a highly controlled explosion. It stood 363 feet tall. That's literally towering over the landscape like a 36-story skyscraper. When those massive engines ignited, they didn't just burn fuel, they burned through 15 tons of fuel every single second. The acoustic shockwave from that launch was so incredibly violent, it literally melted the solid concrete right there at the launch pad. But here's where it gets kinda wild. Once you got past the sheer brute force of those rocket engines, the actual space pods the astronauts sat in were shockingly primitive. I mean, the architecture was stripped down to the absolute bare minimum. You basically had three parts. The command module, which was their cramped living space, the service module, acting as the power unit, and finally, that weird, spider-like lunar module, which was the actual lander that would touch down on the moon. Now, protecting the fragile human bodies inside those primitive little pods was a massive hurdle all on its own. The traditional military aerospace companies kept trying and failing to build a functional spacesuit. Their designs were just way too stiff, they were relying on this bulky, rigid military architecture, and the astronauts literally couldn't move in them. So you know who actually stepped up and built the suits that kept humans alive on the moon? Playtex. Yep, you heard that right. The famous women's bra and girdle company won the contract, utilizing their seamless truss latex technology, a real game changer. And the sheer level of human precision required for this was absolutely staggering. We're not talking about stuff you can just pump out on an assembly line. These suits had to be entirely hand-sewn by master seamstresses, and they had to be accurate to a fraction of a millimeter. The stakes were impossibly high. Just think about it. One single skipped stitch while sewing those layers of nylon and rubber together meant a catastrophic pressure drop in the total vacuum of space. Because the survival odds were so remarkably grim, the reality back home on the ground was terrifying. Insurance companies flat out refused to sell life insurance to the astronauts. They literally stamped the risk as uninsurable. Take a second to really feel the psychological weight of that. You are about to strap yourself on top of 6 million pounds of highly combustible explosives, shooting off into the total unknown, and you can't even guarantee your own family's financial protection if things go sideways. So facing those impossible odds, the crew came up with a brilliant and, honestly, pretty heartbreaking hack. During their pre-flight quarantine, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins sat down and signed hundreds of blank envelopes. They handed these over to a trusted friend who went to the post office and had them postmarked on the exact morning of the launch. The crew knew that if they didn't make it back, these certified space-dated autographs would immediately skyrocket in value. It was basically their DIY life insurance, ensuring their families could sell them off to pay the mortgages and cover college tuitions if tragedy struck. And man, they very nearly needed that fallback plan. If you look closely at the main instrument panel of the lunar module, there's a broken plastic circuit breaker stub. What happened was, while shuffling around inside that incredibly cramped cabin on the moon, one of the astronauts' bulky backpacks accidentally snapped off the plastic knob of the main circuit breaker. And this wasn't just some random light switch. It was the specific breaker required to arm the lone engine meant to blast them off the lunar surface. Without that switch, they were effectively marooned to die 240,000 miles from home. Back in Houston, NASA engineers were frantically scrambling for a fix. But the ultimate solution didn't come from a computer. It came directly from Buzz Aldrin's pocket. He realized that a standard plastic felt tip pen, the kind just floating around in zero gravity, fit perfectly into the broken slot. So he carefully shoved the pen in, manually jammed the circuit closed, and successfully armed the engine. It's wild to think about. But a cheap, everyday plastic pen saved the lives of the crew and the entire legacy of Apollo 11. So, what does all of this mean for us today? Well, remember that back in 1961, computers were literally the size of living rooms. To guide a spacecraft across 240,000 miles of deep space, NASA needed a digital brain that could somehow be shrunk down to fit into a single cubic foot. To solve this impossible math problem, MIT and NASA had to take a massive multi-million-dollar gamble on an unproven, cutting-edge piece of tech called the integrated circuit. You know it today as the microchip. It really all comes down to this one number, 60. NASA single-handedly bought up 60% of every single microchip manufactured in the United States throughout the early 1960s. By stepping up as the ultimate high-paying customer, they essentially forced these early tech factories to figure out how to mass-produce silicon chips reliably and on the cheap. Without that massive influx of government cash and the sheer urgency of the space race, experts estimate the digital revolution would have been delayed by 15 to 20 years. That means the computer boom of the 80s, the internet era of the 90s, and the smartphone you use today would have been pushed way, way deep into the 21st century. And the incredible spillover of innovation didn't just stop at computing either. Monitoring the astronauts' heart rates from deep space via telemetry sensors, that directly birthed the wireless biomedical ICU tracking used in our hospitals today. The need to drill core samples on the moon without access to an electrical outlet forced the creation of high-efficiency cordless power tools. Even the global food safety guidelines and freeze-drying processes used by factories today to prevent contamination in standard commercial grocery packaging, all originally invented by NASA and Pillsbury, so the astronauts wouldn't get violently ill in zero gravity. It kind of forces you to ask, what if there was no Apollo mission? What if the political will had simply died off, or the country just threw in the towel after the tragic Apollo 1 fire that killed 3 astronauts on the launch pad? Without Apollo, we aren't just looking at an alternate timeline with clunkier cell phones, heavier tools, and slower turnet. We're looking at a world with a fundamentally different human psyche. Because, really, the ultimate legacy of Apollo was a profound, irreversible shift in our perspective. On Christmas Eve 1968, the crew of Apollo 8 looked out their window and snapped the legendary Earthrise photograph. For the absolute first time in human history, our entire species saw our planet not as this endless, sprawling continent meant to be conquered, but as a tiny, fragile, profoundly isolated blue marble floating in a hostile, infinite dark. That single image became the literal spark for the global environmental movement, modern conservation efforts, and our collective understanding of global unity. You see, Apollo was never really just about the moon. It was a massive, high-stakes pressure cooker that forced humanity to violently drag its technology, its medicine, and its own perspective into the future. Like the saying goes, we went to find another world, but in the end, we discovered our own. Looking back at the unbelievable world-changing innovations born from that era, it definitely makes you wonder, what kind of impossible challenge do we need today to spark humanity's next giant leap?